First question is for Jeff Goodwin. Oh yeah, where's Jeff?
He took off.
He took off.
He's washing.
All right, well, let's see if any of you other guys are smart enough to answer this. Jeff talked about disturbance. Was he talking about mechanical disturbance or hoof activity and grazing disturbance?
I can answer that for Jeff. He's talking about disturbance. It may be grazing disturbance, it may be hoof disturbance, it may be fire, any disturbance. But we're going to manage that disturbance for the results that we want.
Okay, so you're saying not all disturbance is bad, but it needs to be managed and keep it somewhat limited.
That is correct. Not all disturbance is bad. It's all in how it's managed.
Okay. Next question. This is a question for Paul. Can you talk about no-till planter designs for CRP, native type, bunch grass pastures? You know, what types of drills do you use for, you know, planting that light, fluffy, native type seeds? And then also maybe comment on, you know, brassicas and maybe just talk a little bit about seed size and mixing them together and do they separate and all that.
When it comes to different seed sizes and also different planting depths, there's a rough rule of thumb on your non-fluffy seeds. Whatever the seed diameter is, 10 times that seed diameter is supposed to be your planting depth. You take a look at a small turnip seed, for instance, you know, it's a small dot. 10 times that might be only, you know, a half to 3/4 inch. You take a look at a large bean, 10 times that might be 2 inches. And so I get questions all the time, how do I plant my cover crop cocktails? One of the fears with a small seed is it won't have enough seed energy to make it up out of the soil. When it's in a monoculture, I get concerned. When it's in with, you know, 10 other seeds like I do, the large seeds would come up and crack the soil, such a small seed has a lot more energy to get up and out. And with that in mind, I'd plant a lot of my cover crop cocktails at 2 to 2.5 inches deep because I got a lot of large seed stuff in there. And I'm in an area where a lot of times when I'm planting the cover crop, I got to go that deep to find moisture. And I want to make sure it stays in moisture. And I've been surprised sometimes even down at that depth, those small seeded things will beat the large ones out of the ground. But again, they're working together to get up and out of there. When it comes to the different types of seeds, the more seeds you've got in a cover crop cocktail mix, the less separation you'll have. One of the worst things you could do is like a larger seed like an Austrian winter pea and a small seed like a turnip side by side. Load up the drill. Some of these seed hoppers hold, you know, 500 bushel, and you go for 10 hours. I can guarantee there's going to be some seed separation. But if I've got a huge diversity in mix, the small seeds, large seeds all sort of bridge together and sort of flow down pretty well. My box drill, when I'm full up, you know, 30 to 40 acres, all I can do anyway, I don't have too much problem with seed separation. I do know a few guys that throw in about a pound of sunflowers. Sunflowers in the shell sort of float on top of a mix. And what that'll do is when your cover crop is coming up, if your sunflower is uniformly distributed across the field, you know your seed is fairly uniform. If there's sunflowers all at one end of the field and all the small seeds at the other end of the field, you had some separation. But again, on a cover crop, I don't really care if the uniform distribution or not, because I'm looking at diversity across the field. Now, in regards to the fluffy seeds versus the smooth seeds versus you know, those differences there, I run everything through the same box. That crustbuster drill, the slot works, but I don't have any fluffy seeds in my mixes. I'm not planting the grasses, especially the natives or the perennial grasses. Our research farm that does do a lot of that, we do have the separate fluffy seed box and the small seed, they call it the alfalfa box on there. The disadvantage with that is you have more sprockets to tend with when you're working on your populations. The advantage is you can actually pull the tube from that small seed box, for instance, drill it on the surface versus the large seeds drop it in the bottom of the furrow. And so it gets you some flexibility. It just depends on what you've got available. The one problem I run into, though, when it comes to the seeding depths, every seed diameter opener has a cutting angle to cut residue. And when you're in no-till or going through root balls or root masses, whatever like that, I want that cutting angle to be about a 30 to 45 degree angle. Well, if I take a real large diameter opener and try running real shallow, it's going to be pressing downward. It'll do hairpinning your residue. If you take a real small diameter and try running it deep, you're going to be bulldozing. And the place I run into it a lot of times is a lot of farmers will say, well, I've got that 18-inch opener on the John Deere opener, for instance, that 18-inch disc, it gets to be a little bit dull, and then trying to plant real shallow, you can get a lot of hairpinning. Look at the grass drills, a Truex drill, or some of the early grass drills had little 12 to 14-inch discs on. Shallow depth, you can maintain the cutting angle. White, for instance, on their new planter, they claim they go to 4 inches deep on planting depths now. They went from a 15-inch disc to a 16-inch disc to maintain that cutting angle. And so if you've got a lot of variability in your operation where you're doing a lot of grasses shallow and a lot of other things deep, it might take 2 separate drills.
I've got a follow-up question. On planting depth, as the system gets better and the soil structure gets better, do you guys think you see less issue with planting at 1 inch versus 4 inches because of that better structure and better system?
Structure-wise, I'm less afraid of deeper depths. What happens when you don't have the good structure, especially if you've got a remnants of a tillage pan, say down 6 inches deep. I plant something at 4 inches deep, then I get a rain and saturates that zone. I got an oxygen-starved seed. As my structure builds, that extra rain drains away, I can plant deeper and get away with it. I'm a fan of planting deeper. The deeper I go, especially in my spring planted crops, the more buffered the soil temperature is, the more buffered the soil moisture is, the more uniform my emergence is. And more uniform emergence always gives better yield. With that in mind, we're planting our corn at 3.5 inches deep, our milo at 2, 2.5, and our beans 2.5 to 3, our spring planted crops. But I say it's a far more uniform stand down deeper. Now again, I'm in the area of Nebraska where there are some days you can plant and you're in good moisture, and 3 days of hot, dry wind. Anything shallow is in dry soil. So planting deeper, it helps.
I got a follow-up question, Jim, for your planting opportunities. You know,
I got all these questions here. You guys got to stop asking questions.
We got an
Come
hour
on now.
So let me ask you this: on the window opportunities, do you plant deeper, knowing that August 24th it may be 30 more days before you see it rain if you're planting into moisture? Or how are you doing that?
It depends to me what the forecast is. I'm watching that forecast and taking a gamble of whether I think there's a rain coming or not.
Alan, I'd like you to address some of these questions because you plant you. Well, I want a farmer's perspective on both the seeding depth. You know, you plant a lot of diverse mixes, and I think you run it all through an air seeder. Do you see issues with seed separation? Do you see issues with planting depth? How do you deal with that, you know, in the real world?
Paul explained that pretty well about the seed separations in the diverse mix. We don't see any problem at all with anything separating out. We don't, on the other hand, we don't load up enough for 200 acres and then go out and bounce around for 3 days planting it. We'll do smaller amounts or one field at a time. Something I don't think anybody's addressed is the first year or two of no-till, when there is no soil structure. Hairpinning is a huge problem because you have no structure. You've got nothing for that disc to push against, and you end up hairpinning. That's one of the major problems I see with guys in the first year trying to get a stand when it's the first time they've had residue on their surface ever, and they're trying to plant through it, and they're just making a hairpin mess.
Hairpinning is when you get winter kill with like weed or your cereals not getting deep enough or getting good soil contact or stand.
Yeah, the residue actually gets hairpinned into the furrow with the seed and prevents the furrow from closing. You get winter kill. You get lots of problems from that. It dries out. You don't get good seed to soil contact. The drill just won't work good if it doesn't have something to push against and cut.
And other things that are important there is keep your blades sharp. You may have to replace blades more often. You know, keep them sharp, keep them fairly new. And then don't go out there when the straw is really tough, you know, like if it's, you know, damp in the morning from dew. You know, the drier that stuff is, the better it'll cut.
Yeah.
Yeah, less than 70% humidity, yeah.
I run a John Deere air seeder, and I assume that's what you're talking about for down pressure. I get away with a lot less weight and a lot less pressure than seems like anybody else I talk to, and I don't know if it's just my soils or the facts that we've used a lot of gypsum in our country. My soils don't get rock hard. Oh, that's bad. I've helped a lot of people transition, and one of the things I suggest is put in alfalfa for 3 or 4 years and then start no-tilling it.
The reason you get along better, Alan, is you've been doing this twice as long as the rest of us, and your soil's that much better.
Yeah, I've been no-tilling 22 years. I've got farms that are 22 years in no-till, but I've also got farms that are just 2 and 3 years in no-till, and it always just aggravates me to no end when I take over a new farm and have to start that farm from square one. But I'm getting better at it all the time, and we're bringing them in faster and faster. Yeah, that's right. If you've got cover on the soil, crusting isn't as much of an issue anymore, and that was the reason for planting a little shallower, is because try to get up through a crust. Well, if you're not going to crust, then you can go deeper, and I routinely plant wheat 1 3/4 deep to 2 inches. Yeah.
The other thing with the failure plant deeper is they're used to setting maybe on the 4th notch or whatever you want to call it on your device. Now all of a sudden the depth gauge was riding on a 1/2 inch of residue. You're a 1/2 inch shallower. Maybe you got that residue clump where there's a 3 inch clump of residue. You're out of the soil completely. And so I'd rather err on the side of deeper, and then when you are riding out, you are at the proper depth perhaps. I was giving my presentation one time along with a person who worked with a seed company, seed corn company. He had, his position was between R&D and marketing. He was like, what does the market need? What do we have? What do we take? And he did a lot of field visits on stand complaints. And he said out of his entire 17-year career or something like that, he never had a stand complaint where the crop was planted too deep. He had more failures planted too shallow. And again, go deeper.
With a lot of the producers that I've worked with, their first year or first attempt at trying no-till, they do end up shallow because their soil is hard and they have a mathematical problem of not enough weight on that drill, and they just can't get it in the ground.
Yeah. So most likely you'll have to add weight in the beginning, and then as your soils get in better shape, you can start backing off on how much weight you have.
And that's one reason I showed Mark Watson's SDX air seeder. His weights across the back were plenty for his long-term no-till. It's when he started doing custom work and he's getting called in for 1st or 2nd year no-till, he had to add 600 gallons of water to a 30-foot seeder.
Yeah.
It depends on how the pasture is managed. I've been in some pastures that are harder than tilled ground. And Peterson did a demonstration a couple years ago down in Missouri where he had more erosion runoff from a poorly managed pasture than he did from tilled ground. And again, is how is it managed? What kind of structure do you have? What kind of roots do you have there? The other thing is, when was that existing grass killed or pasture or whatever? In Nebraska, we got a lot of guys who no-till into alfalfa. If I let the alfalfa grow in the spring, use up the excess water, start drying the soil out, kill it, that ground is hard compared to if I killed it last fall, went through a freeze-thaw cycle and had the spring rains to soften it up. Both are no-till into alfalfa, and both, one is impossible and the other is easy.
I'm in the 1st and 2nd year of no-tilling in both pasture and cropland, and I used to have to wait for a rain to stop the ground. The ground's so hard, I can't get a no-till drill in for all in the world more than that. I'm not that information out of it. At least that 1st and 2nd year, it's just like especially not there.
Okay, we better move on, or we're only going to get to 2 questions here. Okay, next question is on mycorrhizae fungi. The question is, how do you increase your mycorrhizae fungi, and what happens to the fungus in frozen ground in the northern part of the country? Who wants to tackle that? Nathan, you're the reigning scientist here.
Could you read the question again? No. So, the way you get mycorrhizae into your fields are the basic edge effects that Brett talked about. They're out there in the range grounds. They're out there in perennial grounds mostly. But when you have a tornado come through your house every day or every 3 or 4 times a year, are you going to rebuild? Quit tilling. Quit tilling. Then the next part that I've understood some of through some of the biologists is that they really don't like the salt that's put into the soil. What's that? Most of our fertilities and a lot of our pesticides. Know what you're managing. I'm not saying don't use those products. I'm saying know what you're doing when you use that tool, like Jim Johnson said. But mycorrhizae is a hard thing right now because it's hard to actually see. You don't just send off a sample and say, do I have it or do I not? So we're early in that science, in my opinion. And so you have to have a little faith, and it's there. Saporitic fungi is a really, really good fungi because without it, we'd be standing in trash up to, I don't know, about 34, 40 inches. They are the first decomposers. That mycorrhizae is what we're after as as it infects the root, it can go out into the rest of the soil profile and suck in nutrients. And so it's abuscular. It goes like a tree. It infects the root, comes out, makes a big fan, and then goes through the... So to get it in there, start managing by these 5 principles. You'll see it come in.
This is my coworker speaking to me, Dale Strickler. Mycorrhizal fungi, you want living roots all year round. Mycorrhizal fungi starts starving out after a month of no roots, no exudates. Phosphorus fertility is more critical than nitrogen because that's the trade-off that it uses. That's pretty much it. Dale, you want to raise your hand? He does a lot of work with mycorrhizal fungi and mycorrhizal fungi spore inoculation.
And I'll make a couple more comments on that. Yeah, the things that will deter mycorrhiza: tillage, fallow periods, and excess phosphorus. Those are the things that will really discourage mycorrhizal growth. Most plants are highly mycorrhizal and will support populations. The exceptions would be brassicas. Brassicas don't need mycorrhiza, so they won't support it. They can't host them. So that's why we would never encourage you to plant an entire field of only brassicas, because you're going to really drive down your mycorrhizal populations. Mycorrhiza can go from one host to another, so keep a living root in the ground and it can jump from one host species to the next if you don't have that long fallow period. Part of this question asks what happens to the fungus in the frozen ground in the northern part of the country, when something's not growing. They will tend to go dormant, and when something's not growing, the mycorrhiza really don't need to be eating. Would you say that's correct, Dale? And the other thing is if you feel like your soil is really beat up and you really want to jumpstart it quicker, you can buy mycorrhizal inoculant. We can mix that right into your seed if you want. It's not cheap because it's a difficult organism to grow and propagate, but you can buy inoculant to get yourself jump-started. Because it's expensive, we feel that the best investment in that is if you're trying to go into a perennial sequence where you're going to have something growing all the time, and it's typically a higher value planting anyway. It might be worth spending some money on making sure you have the mycorrhiza in there for that. And we've probably seen our best success, best return on that investment in a perennial setting. Or I think I've heard Dale talk about too, if you have really high salt soils, high saline soils, the mycorrhiza can help mitigate that too. If you have more questions about mycorrhiza, catch Dale later on because he's done a lot of work in that over the years. Okay. What's that? Compost tea. Compost tea will certainly help with your biology. It's not really going to be a source of mycorrhizal fungi because mycorrhiza is a longer growing process, and I don't know that you really are going to get that through compost tea. It will certainly help the mycorrhiza that you already have in your soil, but I would not look at it as a source of new mycorrhiza. It would definitely help expand the populations that you already have. Here's this question. It says, do you suggest increased seeding rates when planting into higher residue? And if so, how much? Would you increase your seeding rates? Alan, you got the microphone. If you're planting into really high residue, how much would you increase your seeding rates?
It depends on the residue. I plant into 15-foot tall Egyptian wheat stubble, and no, I don't increase at all because it's all up in the air. It's not on the ground. If I've got corn stubble where I know some of those gauge wheels are rolling over those root balls and I'm not getting seed where I want it to, I'll increase the seeding rate a little bit. Maybe, say on wheat, 10%, 15%.
Go ahead, Jim.
In the early days when no-till drills were first coming out and becoming popular for drilled soybeans further east, everyone said you had to increase the seeding rate 20 to 50%. And there were several companies that kept selling their planters saying you could save money on seed. It was because the early no-till drills were so lightweight, could not penetrate soil at proper depth, left half the seeds on top of the ground. And there were some of the old timers said, well, if you don't see half your beans on top of the ground, you're planting too deep. Well, the trouble was those on top didn't grow. And so the 50% you increased was to give you some to see, and those that were in the ground grew. In my long-term experience, when I've done population studies, drill versus planter, on soybeans, milo, and believe it or not on corn as well, my seeding rates are the same when my no-till drill is set up properly, get the seed in the ground. I don't change my seeding rates when I go till to no-till on my comparisons. And in fact, my seeding rates can usually be lower in the no-till because that more buffered soil temperature, better soil moisture, mulch on top, it doesn't crust, it doesn't dry out, doesn't wash out. And so for me, the seeding rate's the same if you have a no-till seeder set up properly. If you've got one that's, like say, not good seed to soil contact, leaving half the seed in an environment that's not going to grow, increasing the seeding rate can make up for it, but I'd rather set the seeder proper to start with.
I'm going to increase seeding rates. Again, it's going to depend on conditions. Maybe 25%, maybe 100%. I wouldn't go over 100%. Usually I tell people as much as they can afford, with the caveat that I'm planting it for forage. And so I'm going to increase my seeding rate so that I can increase that forage production.
Okay, very good. Here's a question for Jimmy Emmons. How do you control weeds in the wheat after milo? And I assume they're talking about after your milo that maybe had the companions. And then a follow-up, what rate of wheat, at what rate how do you control weeds and at what rate? And do you have any troubles grazing your milo? I assume that's a prussic acid probably issue.
Okay. How we control weeds is in the system. We have a diverse rotation, so my goal is not to have the same crop on the same acre but every 4 years. Now when I break that rule, like I give this afternoon where I followed a summer grass forage crop with a milo crop, then I have issues, and I shouldn't have broke that rule. So let's live and learn. And I done the same thing with beans. I went back to beans 2 years, once again chasing revenue, which I preach against, but we all once in a while get trapped. Every time I break that rule, I say I'm not going to do that again, and I mean it this time. And no, I don't have any trouble grazing the milo, especially if I got companions in there. And with the winter wheat then, we've done dried down the stalks, and once in a while you might have a grain issue if you got a lot of down milo, but you kind of got to watch that a little bit. But other than that, no, we don't have any trouble.
The diversity is important. The other thing is you have to know your weeds. You don't use the same herbicide to increase the rate because the weed is there. For instance, on our farm we raise grain sorghum, soybeans, wheat, and corn. Our soybeans, we use both Roundup Ready and Liberty Link, different fields depending on what the weed problem is. You make sure the field's labeled. You don't want to spray the wrong one on the product. The other thing is on our pre's, we put down an early pre-plant. We have 3 different early pre-plants we put down. Is it going to be beans on beans? Is it going to be wheat in that fall? Or is it going to be corn or milo that next year? And so when people ask me what's my bean herbicide, I ask them what's their rotation. Because like I say, between our combinations, we've actually got 3 different pre's and 2 different posts. And so there's quite a combination there just for weed control in soybeans. But what is your weed? What's your next crop?
One of the things I didn't talk about today was my weed control in the milo. That was no herbicides the last 2 years. But I've also facilitated that with the rotation that I've been in small grains or cool seasons before that. So that would naturally help you facilitate grasses, not broadleaves. Once you go to a grain sorghum, you're going to start facilitating broadleaves. So in the rotations, how you manage that. So I've got by with no herbicides, but you also got to watch that in the rotation. You can manage that, and you can do it.
You're kind of saying your weed control almost starts a couple years earlier by what you did leading up to it.
Yeah, and if you listen to Dr. Anderson, Randy Anderson, where you have 2 cools and 2 warms in the rotation, and you do that 2 cools, 2 different cools, 2 different warms, that will help in that weed suppression and not having to use herbicides.
Okay, very good, thank you. Here is a question asking, what is a proscope? Did somebody talk about a proscope earlier?
Yeah.
Caleb, do you have a picture of that? All right, there you go. I got it up here, Jimmy, if you want to tell people about that.
Yeah, that's fast. I must have the internet here. So, yeah, this is what we use. Willie Durham, and I'm sure Nathan's got some of these too. $149 buys this. That scope actually snaps onto your phone, but then the scope itself snaps to the bracket. So I have multiple brackets, one for an iPad, one for a phone. I like it on the iPad because I can just leave it on there when we're out in the field. If you put it on your phone, it's hard to put in your pocket, and if you need to talk on it. But it goes over the camera, and it's at 10 to 15. You can get different magnifications of the scope, but typically they're 10 to 15. But then when you go with your camera, you can blow your zoom in on your camera, then it will extend that. And then if I really want a good picture, I'll do that to maximum, take a screenshot, and then blow it up again. And you can really get some really good pictures in the soil. So it's pretty economical.
For $150, I got one, and you know, it's pretty cool. I did our local, we have an ag kind of a teaching facility there in Hastings, and they do a soil health day or a soil festival for all the 5th graders. And so I had a session with all the 5th graders, and I had a proscope on, and you know, we were looking at, you know, at worms and at soil structure, just, you know, just what's just in soil. And it's pretty cool because, yeah, it's a pretty simple way to show some pretty neat stuff. So if you're into that kind of thing, $150, it's a pretty cheap investment. I don't know if they have it for Droid phones. It's just a different bracket is all. So
Yeah,
you can order it on Amazon.
Yeah, when you go on there, they'll ask you what kind of device you want to put that on,
Yeah.
and it's world's wide open.
Okay, here's a question. Can any of you share any thoughts on reducing soil pH from like an 8 down to a 7? And you know, obviously, you know, what would be some ways that you could reduce soil pH within a system?
We fight that a little bit on a couple of pivots along the river. We'll use gypsum to help that a little bit. It's easier to raise pH than it is to lower pH, and it's going to be a long-term battle. And so you'll have to watch species, what will grow better in high pH, but we'll put gypsum on to help that.
His comment here is ammonium sulfate in row. I was going to mention a sulfur. In gypsum, it's the sulfur components offsetting the pH. In my world travels, I visited a farm in Turkey. The soil pH was 8.7. And they actually set up a sprayer with stainless steel boom, stainless steel nozzles, and they're spraying concentrated hydrochloric acid, trying to offset the base. After about 3 of their employees got chemical burns, they stopped doing that, and the sprayer's just sitting. And I'm like, there's a bunch of stainless steel here that didn't come free. They switched over to 90% sulfur, elemental sulfur, applying that. But that is a very slow process. It is a little bit every year, just trying to get that thing fixed. Now, if you're a small-time gardener or something like that, I got blueberries at home. They love acid soils. Gurney's catalog sells a bag of elemental sulfur to plant with your blueberries. Just get the pH lowered enough for the blueberries. On a per acre basis, I can't recommend that one. That bag is pretty expensive. But again, what they were doing there in Turkey, they were applying the elemental sulfur. It was 90% sulfur. And it was actually the brand they had called was Brimstone. And that's about what it smelled like.
The other thing, you know, I talked about, you know, one of the functions of carbon in your soil is carbon will help buffer both high and low pHs, and it will help all those organisms to function in a much wider pH range. So simply by improving the amount of organic matter that you have in your soil, you can be much more productive on either high or low pH soils. Even though you didn't change the pH, you've changed the carbon, because I think that allows the organisms to buffer their little micro pHs right around them. The organisms will change the micro pH even if you're not picking that up on a soil test. So healthy soils, you can grow some things in high and low pH soils that the textbooks say that you really shouldn't be able to do. Okay, here's a question kind of for any of you that are doing active farming, active production. Have you been able to reduce your herbicide applications after implementing soil health principles?
Yes. Generally, the more cover we keep on the ground, the less problem we have with weeds. We've got all the, you know, prairie cup grass, all the resistant weeds, mare's tail, pigweeds, palmers, water hemp. We've got them all in our country, and almost everything I grow is non-GMO. There's very limited herbicide options for the things that I've grown, so I have to do biological things, cultural things to control the weeds. And so far we've been really successful. There's a few instances where we've had just weather disasters where the weather is completely against us, and I just come in and smoke the whole field, start over again. I won't tolerate a weedy mess to harvest.
Yeah, I agree. The better we can get a cover crop, the thicker the mat, especially if we're going into spring crops. We want that rye to get pocket, shoulder high, thick density. We're still planting rye right now. We've upped the seeding rate because we want that population high. We want that really thick. We can start suppressing them weeds. Rotation, as I talked about earlier, is another way. If you keep going wheat on wheat on wheat, you're going to facilitate grasses, sheet, and all that. Same way with broadleaves. So it's all about the rotation in the system. I can't strongly say that anymore. It's the system, and if you don't have a systems approach and a good rotation, you're going to have problems. And the better the cover, the better the mat, the better the rotation, the less pressure.
My cropping plans are usually 2 to 3 years out. I need to kind of know what I'm going to do, what I plan to do 2 to 3 years out, to know, you know, if I need to plant something that's not real competitive to weeds, I need to do other things up front to reduce the weed population before I get to that crop. Or if I know I'm going to have weed issues, I plant a really competitive crop that will outcompete the weeds, or it'll grow when the weeds won't grow.
Okay, very good. I think the key there too is, you know, like Jimmy said, it has to be a whole system. You can't just focus on one principle of soil health. You have to be looking at all of them within a system. You need the coverage, but you also need the diversity, and the livestock can play a crucial role in there too. Here's a question about asking, does turning crops under, and I'm assuming they're talking about tilling a cover crop in, does turning crops under improve organic matter levels in the soil?
I wouldn't know that.
I said I took my long-term tillage plots. I started in 1981. In 2007, I took the disc treatment, added a cover crop to it with disking it to kill it versus the no-till. The disking eliminates the benefit of the cover. Don't gain anything in organic matter. I actually lose in yield because I'm losing residue as well, and the cost of the cover itself. When it comes to putting the yields in order, soybeans, it's typically with cover is highest, without cover for no-till is next. Disking with cover is the lowest, if you put those 4 in a row. With corn, the top 2 flip-flop. For me in southeast Nebraska, that moisture early, I got to kill my cover fairly early to keep my corn yields up. And again, it's because cereal rye in there and corn, grass and grass just don't quite get along. The beans into there, no problem. But again, where I do the tillage, I lose the benefit. We have a faculty member, his master's or his PhD before he came on board, Sam Ortman, was looking at cover crops for biological weed control and organic systems. He looked at 2 species, 4 species, 6 species, 8 species. He looked at tillage to terminate them. Since it was organic, he was not using chemical, but he was using a disc to incorporate them completely or a blade undercutter to undercut them. He found at 2 or 4 species with tillage there was no weed control benefits at all. When he was at 8 species with a blade undercutter, the diversity on top and the blade undercutting leaving the diversity on top suppressed weeds. And he was basically saying if you're looking at weed suppression, you're going to look at more diversity, and I think it fits with more diversity against the weed diversity as well. But again, with tillage, he found it wasn't effective.
And I think there's a big misconception that if you grow all this biomass, that you don't get any soil benefit unless you plow it under, because otherwise it can't decompose. And that's completely saying that the biology does nothing. And anybody that's been no-till very long understands that in the beginning of no-till, you may have too much residue you have to deal with, or have a lot of residue. But once you get into the system, you're going to be fighting to try to keep residue on top of the ground, because even though you're doing no tillage, that residue disappears because it's being decomposed and cycled so very fast.
I just can't stress how much damage tillage does to your soil. I make a comparison in a talk about a tornado. Nathan talked about that a while ago. I hope that's where he got that idea from, but oh, I know. Yeah. All right. Well, I gotta give him a hard time, but if you have to have a tornado come through your town, you just want it one time in a lifetime. If you think about tilling 4, 5, 6 times like my neighbors do, the infrastructure of the biology, the earthworms, the biology, the mycorrhizal fungi is decimated. So try to get out of your mind tillage if you want to improve soil health, because it absolutely is devastating to the soil.
Here's a question on soil testing. The question is, how do you test for soil carbon? And if somebody wants to just talk maybe about a traditional soil test, and maybe briefly talk about the Haney test as well. Jim Johnson.
There are various tests for soil carbon. The Haney test can measure water extractable carbon. We can use combustion to measure organic carbon or organic matter. We can use acid to measure what sounds crazy but non-organic carbon, basically carbon that's tied up in things like calcium carbonate and other minerals in the soil. We can use CO2 respiration, the CO2 burst test, to get an indication of carbon. It's not going to be true to how much carbon there is, but it will give an indication of carbon. And so there's various tests, and there's even there's new technology all the time. We met with a young man just recently who's developed an optical sensor for carbon, and it's about the size of a phone, and you just lay it on the soil surface, and it optically can measure carbon, and it's got a pretty good correlation when you actually do the lab chemistry. So there's various methods. None of those methods are on your standard soil test, though. If you just do a routine analysis with a university soil test, you won't get an indication of carbon other than organic matter. And that's going to measure that stable fraction of organic carbon in the soil, the humus. But there's other tools to test for carbon, and Haney's the one that I personally like the best.
Yeah, and so if you're not familiar with the Haney test, get on YouTube and just search for Haney soil test. There'll be a number of good presentations on there talking about what that means. Here's kind of an interesting one. You got something to say about it? Okay. All right, well, we'll let you answer this one. How do you bring back land that has had a salt or oil spill on it?
Thanks, Keith.
Well, you opened your mouth.
Yeah, exactly. So Haney talks about the quality of carbon. I'm just going to ignore that question. Hey, salt spills. I grew up in Archer City. So one of the first things that I was doing for the district was pretty much whatever came through the door. And a guy brought me a sample and said, here, I'd like to see what will grow on this. And so I did an EC test, electrical conductivity. And there was no plant that I could find that would grow in that. Bermuda grass was the closest with like 20, 25 EC. And this was way above that. So a lot of those salt affected soils really won't come back. And the reason why is because if you added enough gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, on top of the ground and watered it in, then the calcium would knock the sodium off of the soil colloid. So then the sodium that's affecting all that could be leached out with water down out of the profile. If you could do that, then you could get a plant to grow. But that takes irrigation, which we didn't have on any of those, and it would take a lot of gypsum with a lot of water to leach that out. So that process has to be done in order to reclaim those areas. Some of them, if they're not that salty, and if you can get gypsum and have some big rains, you might be able to flush it out and get something started. I've seen people take hay bales and just line it over and over, year after year, and feed all your cattle down there. And that may get enough organic matter to just start getting little spots growth. But really what you need to do is take it, send it off to see what the EC is. Find out if you're even close to a level where some plant that we have is adapted to those. And so it's hard. Go test your soil, and then really it's about what resources you have.
How about oil spill?
And I'm probably not the one to look at on that. I would say if it's just oil, it's not an issue. It's going to break down and decompose, and you got carbon there basically. It's the salt water that you have to worry about.
I grew up with an oil spill around our shop. We called it weed control. And that's where all the used oil went, years and years and years, 40 years of it, until my dad retired and I quit doing that. And after about 5 or 6 years, there's nothing left. There's grass, and it looks just like everything else. It degrades.
Yeah. So the oil's not as big a deal as the salt. Like Nathan said, get a test. There are some plants that can handle fairly salty soils. That's what you would need to start with. But yeah, you need to kind of have a baseline to know where you're at. Here's a good question for the producers, or really anybody. You can talk about other people you've seen. What are the 1 or 2 biggest changes that you've made on your farm in the last 20 years to increase your profitability? 1 or 2 biggest changes that you've made to increase your profitability?
Growing second crops after small grain crops. That was completely unheard of in our area. It couldn't be done because you spent all summer plowing it. I started 20 years ago, started growing soybeans, grain sorghum, millets, cowpeas, all these other crops that almost always made more money than the wheat crop did. But I could grow the wheat crop, I could pay the rent, and then I had the rest of the summer to grow something else. And that's probably had the biggest thing, and that led me into the whole seed business.
A lot of the seed you grow for us comes as a second crop.
Yes, a lot of them come as second crops because our season is so long. We'll actually wait after wheat harvest until we plant the second crop. We've got an extremely long season to deal with.
And then that's also really adding to your soil health because you've got that
yeah.
living root growing so much longer than anybody else does.
Right, we've got living roots basically all year. When one crop comes out, it's not very long before the next one goes back in.
Yeah, everything Alan talking about, but where that starts is between your ears. And you've got to change the mindset of the traditional production system and not being afraid of growing something 24/7, 365. We try to keep something green in front of our cattle 365 days a year. When we started in that process, the neighbor said you can't do that because you're going to use all your water up. If you're going to plant a second crop behind wheat, we can't even grow one. Well, yeah, you can't because you're tilling it, you're mismanaging the system, and we get plenty of rain normally. Now, there's going to be droughts and there's going to be wet spells, but on the average, in Leedy, Oklahoma, I get plenty of rainfall if I manage that by getting it in the ground and protect it down deep enough where we don't evaporate that. The problem is most of the neighbors and the friends that I've got run their water off out of the field, and so yes, they're very stressed to raise one crop. Once we got that between our ears and understood the water cycle system and aggregation and the cover crop system, then it's just like Alan said, it's no problem for us to grow 2 crops a year and cover crops in between.
I don't have 20 years experience here, but I've got 18, and the guys that I have seen, the change that they've made that I think I could paint a broad brush across the board is they've got out of the commodity business and they've found a marketing niche, whether that's getting out of commodity beef that just go across the scale and going into selling pasture-fed retail cuts, or whether that's getting out of commodity wheat that just goes across the scale, and maybe is as simple as having your own on-farm storage so that you can market it when and where you want.
If you're going to grow grains, you're going to pay for storage. It's going to be yours or it's going to be somebody else's.
I'll tell you, if you didn't come to my field day, I'm just getting into cattle, and this is thanks, Jimmy. Not so much on the experience side, but if I didn't have another way to cut back costs, I wouldn't be getting livestock. Basically, what I'm looking at trying to do with the system is moving once a day, grazing forages all year round, not feeding hay. Equipment is expensive. The little equipment that I can use, Alan is letting me rent. Alan has given me a great opportunity to run cattle on some of his gaps that he isn't filling. So that gives me a good opportunity. But the way I see it is I cannot afford large capital items to get into it. Polyewire is really cheap. I don't even use a 4-wheeler at the moment, and it's taking me 45 minutes to an hour a day to move cows right now. So, and you know, how long does it take time to feed hay, bale hay, haul manure back out to the field? You figure up those times, it's probably 4 to 5 hours in a day just doing all that other work. So that's how I see it, as an opportunity for me to get in, or somebody that has been in livestock for 20 years, cut back on some of your capital expenses. Maintenance is another huge one. There's not going to be much maintenance for me so far. So,
Just as in nature, stability comes with diversity. So stacking enterprises and diversifying portfolio is the way to be more efficient. That's what you all said.
All right, I think that's an excellent way to end the day. Let's give these guys a hand.